And we are live. So, welcome everyone to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller. Today we have a returning guest, actually for the third time, climate scientist Kevin Anderson. Welcome, Kevin. It's
Yeah, it's
great to
nice to be
have you
with you.
here. But one of the things everyone can do is to talk about climate change. And so, therefore, please like and subscribe to this video and share it with your friends. So, I'm going to just say that right up front. It's a very simple thing. And it actually really does make a difference to get everyone talking about climate change, especially when we're talking about it as seriously as we will today. So, welcome, Kevin. Sorry about that. And last time, in our last interview, you went through your bio, which is really interesting, and you worked in the oil and gas industry and things like that. People want to see that. There's a link to that talk in the description, but maybe you can just tell us about your current affiliation and what you're working on right now.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm Professor of Energy and Climate Change at the University of Manchester, and I also work at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. And most of my work nowadays, well, it has been for a long time, it's really the same thing. It's translating the commitments that we've made on climate change through what the science tells us, but the best way we understand climate change through the science, and then playing that out into what we need to do to deliver the commitments that we've made. And so it's trying to sort of stand back and look at the climate issue as from a systemic point of view. But I have very much an energy focus. So I think it's really important to emphasize how important the agricultural side, the land use side, production of food is to emissions. And it's probably about 20-25% of our warming. But most of the warming relates to the energy sector. And it's that sector I'm principally interested in. But it's really translating, using the science to translate our commitments into what we need to do about climate change. And that's how I see my role.
Well, we'll be talking about that today. Well, actually, so just going on from there, in a recent interview with Frank Breeze, I believe it was, and I
Nick
linked,
Breeze, yeah.
no, Nick Breeze, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
and I linked that in the description as well. You said that climate scientists must be frank and honest about future climate change and the solutions being proposed.
Mm.
What do you mean by that, and why did you say that?
Again, this is something I've been saying for a very long time. I think we must have spoken about this in our previous discussions. Let's be really clear. The scientists, overall, the scientists who've engaged in climate change have done a fantastic job against a lot of opposition in understanding climate change through the typical tools of science. There is no climate science. There's science, and we use the tools of science understand climate change, like we use those same tools of science to understand other physical phenomena in our lives. And they did a fantastic job there. And they were up against deliberate lying and deception by the chief executives of the oil majors. Mm-hmm. So let's not pussyfoot around that. They lied, they manipulated, and they had huge funds, and they also bought a lot of policymakers and politicians. And yet, I think what was really interesting over that quite a long period of time, eventually, the science won through. And there are undoubtedly still some science skeptics out there. But by and large, I think most of us now accept the science. So we did a fantastic job there, or at least the climate scientists did. But when it came to thinking about, well, what does that science tell us about the sorts of things we need to be doing if we're to deliver our commitments on climate change? Then I think we have run scared of the policymakers. We've run scared of business as usual. We've run scared of rocking the boat where we are and where our colleagues are, where prestige exists, where our incomes come from. So we have continually and repeatedly, now for over 30 years, softened the message, sweetened the pill. And the problem is that every year that we fail on climate change, the challenge the following year is not the same. It's 40 billion tons harder. So we're a third of a billion tons more challenging now than it was at the time. Sorry, a third of a trillion tons. Sorry,
third of a trillion
tons harder now than it was at the time of the Paris Agreement. It's about a trillion tons harder than it was at the time of the big Rio Earth Summit back in 1992, when the whole sort of climate agenda came to the sort of political fore. And so a trillion tons since there, third of a trillion tons since Paris. This last year, another 40 billion tons pumped into the atmosphere. Every year it gets harder. And every year we have to find more exotic ways to sweeten the pill. At some point, we have to step back and say, We have to say it as it is. How do we expect the policymakers, the public, wider civil society, business leaders and others to really grapple with the challenges we face if the expert community itself is deliberately manipulating the assumptions and sweetening the pill to make it sound more appealing? And I've listened to the interviews that you've had with some of the other guests on your show. I listened to another one yesterday from another interview, and so typical it is of the experts to basically shoehorn technical fixes into business as usual and broadly give the message that we'll be okay, don't worry. That is incredibly dangerous. And my concern a lot of the time is that if you talk to these people privately, they tell you something very different. And I don't think it's the role of experts to sweeten the pill. It's the role of experts to say it as they see it, not to say what's politically acceptable.
Well, you just made me jump to a question I had a little bit later, but let's go through it right now. So climate scientists Michael Mann and Catherine Hayhoe, both guests on Climate Chat, by the way. People can go look those up. And other climate scientists, just as you were saying, focus their message on hope and technological solutions like renewable energy is getting cheaper and batteries getting cheaper and wind. And so they paint a positive picture. But the results of the US election recently, I think, where climate change was barely mentioned at all, seems to indicate that that's not an effective way to engage the public or policymakers. I mean, if it sounds good, why focus on? And I should also say that the other side uses fear as sort of the main message, and it worked quite well, as we just saw. So you kind of alluded to a little bit, but what's your thoughts on what should climate scientists be saying that's truthful and might reach the public?
Well, oddly enough, I don't think it's our job to say something that's necessarily appealing to the public. Our job is to do our work as diligently and carefully as we can, and then communicate it as clearly as we can. And that doesn't mean dumbing down. If we can't communicate our work in a clear language, it probably means we don't understand our own work well enough. So it's not about dumbing down. It's about communicating our work and our conclusions honestly and directly. Not about sweetening the pill, not worrying about hope or despair, not providing doom or rosy pictures of the future. That is for others, other people involved in the climate debate, and it's for them to think about those issues. It is important that the experts maintain a very strong thread of integrity here. And don't think what will make, we shouldn't be worried about making people fearful or making people hopeful or spreading a message of doom. And that is wrong to be thinking about the psychology of the user of the information, really. It is our job just to inform the debate as best that we can. And I think as soon as we start to spin it, and I would argue that happens a lot, then I think, how can we expect the policymakers to think about these issues seriously? How can we expect the media and the journalists to report it fairly if the expert community has already made its best guess as to what message it should tell the public? And this is nothing new. I say this has been going on, I think, for several decades. But because it's climate change is a cumulative problem, every year we fail, it gets harder. Then we have to spin more and more elaborate stories. And it's always about technology. I mean, you hear this, whether it's going to be renewables are going to save us, energy efficiency, nuclear, negative emission technologies, geo-engineering. It's never about the sort of things that actually the time frame tells us is so important. Using the technologies we have today, using the policies we have today, thinking about issues of who are the emitters. It's never unpicking that story because that is too challenging. It's too politically difficult for us. And also, I think within it, we as the expert community, by and large, we are part of the problem. Many of your interviews, so I've listened to quite a few now, and many other people when they've been interviewed elsewhere, they'll all talk about, well, last time I was in Japan, we had the meeting there. And then I was in New York last week and we were discussing this. Now, these people already will be on very high incomes. They'll have very high carbon footprints. And what they are often unable to do is to see the way that they are living their lives as being deeply embedded in the problem. And so I think the solution space that becomes available to them is one that is not in line with their own science. So there's this duality, if you like, going on, or this cognitive dissonance that's going on.
No. Mm-hmm. So, well, there's a lot in there. One thing I'd just love to ask, okay, given that, what would you say is the situation we're in now from the science side, without spinning, but just where are we now, and where are we going in the next, let's say, 20 years or something like that, based on reality?
I mean, this is always a judgment call that we all have to make. And if you'd asked me a month ago, I would be deeply pessimistic, but I'm much more pessimistic now than I was a month ago. And it's not to do with COP. I mean, COP was an irrelevance, as they usually are. It's actually due to spending a bit of time reading and listening to people talking about the AMOC situation, which we may come to later. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's just another appalling potential change that is on the horizon, and not the horizon far in the distance either. I mean, a horizon between sort of now and the end of the century, which is almost nothing,
or sooner.
Well, now it won't be sooner than now, but I mean, it's starting to.
No. I mean, mid-century is sort of the time frame that's spoken about.
Yeah, some people are talking about but sometime during that period, it looks like that's going to be. So that I can't see how that can be other than described as catastrophic. Mm-hmm. That seemed to me to be the case. And so things were bad anyway, and now we're layering that on top. So I think we are in a dire situation. And set against that, as someone who spends a lot of my time trying to look at how people are talking about what we need to do about climate change, there is nothing there. There's no real dialogue within the establishment anyway, and within the mainstream media, within the mainstream expert community, that in any way, shape or form aligns with the analysis that comes out of the mainstream expert community. So
specifically on AMOC, are you talking about AMOC and specifically?
No, more generally across the board. And then AMOC just adds to that. I think again, it's listening to some of your other interviews, people are always promoting some technology or the other. I heard someone the other day, I'm not going to say who it was, talking about they've been working on something to do with steel in their garage. I mean, that's the issue. It doesn't matter what an inventor does in their garage with steel. That will not be part of the climate solution space, if you like, in a time frame that aligns with the commitments and the challenges that we face. And yet we still talk about that as somehow that you'll find a little scheme that will work, a pilot plant here or there that might have done something. And then that gets played up in a really positive light that you can do something about it based on this laboratory experiment. And so I'm in a position at the moment where if I look for threads of hope, I struggle to find any. But that's no excuse for despair. But I don't think there's nothing out there at the moment that suggests we're going to respond to climate change in a timely fashion, that we will go to such a point where the impacts of climate change will force major social change, and it will be catastrophic for many people around the planet, and eventually for all of us, and indeed many other species, of course. There seems to be little at the moment that's taken us off that pathway. But as I say, that is no reason for despair. It's a reason to try much harder. Because I can't see what those threads of hope are, doesn't mean to say they don't exist. And the more that we pursue them, the more we try and have these open, frank, honest discussions and have come to different conclusions, admittedly, then the greater is the potential for us to actually drive some meaningful change. But at the moment, where we're heading looks dire. There's little to be optimistic about.
So back in 2010, you wrote a paper and gave some talks about going beyond dangerous, which kind of blew me away back then, like, oh my God, you're like, what the math just doesn't work, and how. No. But that did motivate me I mean, I was kind of a little depressed there, but it did motivate me to try harder in my outreach efforts and what I was doing for climate. I think that's one reaction. I think there is another reaction. People get despair if they don't feel empowered what they can do. And I'll repeat again, one of the easiest things you can do, which would be effective, is speaking to everybody about climate change. Because once it becomes the thing that everyone's talking about, that's when you can actually imagine policymakers paying attention and doing something. Because right now, again, it wasn't even mentioned barely at the last election, which is pretty crazy. But getting back, so so I'm a little more optimistic than you because I'm that techno-optimistic kind of guy. It sounds to me like you're laying out the case for solar geoengineering, because solar geoengineering is something that, first of all, we kind of know will work because it happens naturally a few times a century anyway. We're doing it today and it's working quite well, and we're reducing it, and it's warming, it's accelerating warming right now because we're reducing it, but we're put it in the lower atmosphere where people breathe it, and it contributes to 8 million deaths a year, and it falls out of the sky in a week, whereas in the stratosphere, it lasts for a year, and it rains out instead of breathing it, so it's safer for health reasons too. But we kind of know it will work. You're saying it's a plan B thing, right? Plan A is doing what you say, reduce our emissions, make societal changes. That's all really obvious things. And we're just not doing it. We haven't done it for 40 years. I agree with you. I don't see a major change happening soon. So the plan B things are to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere that we already put up there, which is expensive and long-term. Solar geoengineering works in a couple of years. So what's your thoughts on solar geoengineering? You heard mine.
Yeah. So there's thoughts I might have on the technology itself.
Okay. And there's different ways to do it. Yeah, of course. As well.
About how we might do. So there are the engineering challenges there, there are the science challenges there, but they also play out in the political challenges. I mean, what happens if you end up disrupting monsoon patterns, doing things that we hadn't expected? What happens then? Who's in control of this? How do you get government agreement with these things? So there's a lot there. There's a lot of things from the technology and the science through to what would be the structures and the norms within which you might try to do this at scale. But I would also say that isn't that there's a plan A and a plan B. The reason that plan A is failing, if that's the right way to describe it, emission reductions, is in part because there's a postulated a plan B.
That's one way of thinking about it. That's the moral hazard.
It's certainly
that's the moral hazard part, right?
Yeah, the moral hazard part. But firstly, there isn't a plan B. We don't know if plan B would work technically. We don't know that. So you're saying it would work. There are other people out there who come to different conclusions. So that's why I'm saying it's something we have to investigate. And so there's there's an important discussion and research task to be taken, to be had in looking at various geoengineering options, whatever they may be. At many levels, at the technical level, the science level, the implications level, but then also how you might actually apply these things and the timeframe issues and all those. There's a whole suite of things there, from governance, from technology and science through to governance. Sure. So those things need to be investigated, and it's possible we may have to pursue them. But in my view, it's absolutely clear that even talking about this now, I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about it, and this is a bit dilemma, but even talking about it, this will already be feeding into delayed action elsewhere. In the same way that negative emission technologies, sucking CO2 out the air, has actually undermined the need for action, that has undermined the scale of the challenge that the climate scientists, the academics, the experts have said is now necessary, because they're so deeply embedded in virtually everyone's comment about what we need to do. So when Catherine Hayhoe's talking about this, or Michael Mann's talking about this, or Stefan Ramsdorff's talking about this, or Hannah Rich is talking about this, they're in the back of their mind is that, of course, we will be using hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal, which allows them to talk about the technologies in a time frame that is not compatible with the carbon budgets that we have. Negative emissions fits into that, overshoot fits into that, and now I think geoengineering fits into that. So all of these things are, in a sense, they're not material, but they're made material as if they exist to allow us to delay action today. So let's not pretend that discussions around geoengineering, that there's no cost to that. The cost is the lives of the people that would be lost because it has undermined the need for pushing action today. And it's undermined that need in part because the expert community can avoid talking about those challenges. So we haven't opened up the dialogue. We haven't done mitigation. We haven't needed to do mitigation because the experts have said, don't worry, we'll have some shiny kit in the future that will solve it for us. When that's, I mean, I heard you say the other day about EVs, when one of your discussions, I think with Saul Griffiths, about, well, they're obviously good. Well, why is an EV obviously good? I mean, there's no question there. An EV that weighs 2 to 3 tons, that is transporting 80 kilograms of human a few kilometers, and that's said to be a good form of transport. I would beg to differ on that. If you'd said
relative to ICE cars, but yes, I agree. Bicycles are better, much better. Yeah.
So you might argue that EVs are the right solution to cars, but you may argue that cars aren't the right solution to transport issues.
No, of course, I agree.
But because of the language you use, that already locks in that EVs must be good. It means we don't stop and ask the question. We don't stop and ask the question. Every kilowatt hour we put into this very large car that then moves the human just a few kilometers is a kilowatt hour we cannot put into an industry. We can't put it into running our operating theatres, into our schools, our libraries, because that kilowatt hour is now used in the car to move 2,000 kilograms of metal a few kilometers for no point other than moving me. I could have got on a bus, a train, I could have walked or cycled. We normalize that. That comes into our normal dialogue, and then we say, don't worry, we've got negative emissions. We've got geoengineering. We need to go back and ask those more fundamental questions. And my concern about geoengineering, it's another way to avoid asking those questions. So whilst, as I said at the beginning, yes, let's do the work on these things, from the science, the technology, and the governance, but let's also be very clear, they are already changing the framing of the debate on climate change.
But you're, okay, I have 2 major points on that. One, and there's an implicit assumption in what you're saying that if we didn't have those things, if geoengineering wasn't a thing, it didn't exist as a concept yet, and even carbon removal didn't exist, that somehow now we would be reducing our emissions dramatically.
No.
That's not true.
No, but I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, remember, we don't have to reduce our emissions. Why would we need to reduce our emissions? Because the experts have told us we don't particularly. We can rely on EVs that you've already spoken about. Then we can rely on carbon capture and storage. We can rely on some of the technologies maybe we might to apply to cement. We can use, I heard the recent discussion you had, someone talking about batteries for planes. It's all about business as usual can carry on because we can bolt some technology on there. And that's the expert saying this. Actually, that doesn't.
I'm confused now. Wait a second. But right before you started talking about EVs, you were talking about how geoengineering and carbon removal are used as excuses for inaction.
Yep, but the inaction.
So either they are or they aren't. I don't know. I'm suggesting that even if they didn't exist, it's not like we would be doing action. We would use another excuse like EVs or whatever the excuse might be.
But
in other words, it's not the thing itself. It's just a useful idiot kind of thing for people to use.
No, because the reason I'm saying this is because I do not expect the policymakers, or let's say the journalists, the policymakers and civil society, to really be aware of the challenges we face unless the expert community, we are paid to do this is our job, unless the expert community describes things more in line with what our analysis and our conclusions are. Mm-hmm. But we don't. And the way we're able to hold that cognitive dissonance is because we can now, in our own expertise, we've now relied on the geoengineering. We, the experts, have relied on geoengineering. We, the experts, have relied on overshoot. We, the experts, have relied on sucking hundreds of billions of CO2 out of the atmosphere in the future. So every single scenario from the IPCC does not have to question business as usual. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. If the expert community isn't informing civil society and the policymakers appropriately, because they're reliant on these things in the future, shiny bits of kit in the future, then we are not informing the debate. I'm not saying things would have changed, but we don't know because the expert community has not been honest. And geoengineering only feeds into that, it is feeding into that at the same time as potential being something we should be considering. And I'll just add one more bit about this, is whether it's on negative emissions or people work on negative emissions or people that work on geoengineering, I almost always hear them say, we have to do everything we can on mitigation. And then we have geoengineering. But every time they're saying that from another conference they've flown to. So there's nothing changing in the norms of their lives that they're prepared to have adjusted. So basically what they're saying is, we have to do everything we can on mitigation that doesn't change business as usual. Doesn't mean that people like me can carry on living like I am today in my large house, big car, flying all around the world, consuming lots of goods. As long as you don't question that, we can try mitigation, but therefore we're going to need geoengineering. So we lock it in, not just by evoking it in our language, but by the norms of how we, the people evoking it, are behaving. The experts are behaving in a way that climate change is not important. There's no credibility lent to our arguments because it doesn't look like we think it's serious. If you look at the COP, it doesn't look like it's serious. All these people flying over to
100,000 now. I mean, I went to COP in Copenhagen, and I think there were 20,000 people, 100,000 people flying to Azerbaijan. I mean,
yeah. And so it doesn't lend any sense of these things being serious. So until I see the geoengineering community, the negative emissions community, and indeed many of the people working on these things actually demonstrating, I think this is really serious. I mean, absolutely, dire consequences by the things that we do in our lives, as well as the messages we're giving, then I think we just carry on with it being a little sideshow to what the politics is dealing with, all the other things that politics is dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
Well, for those who are listening to this interview with you first and don't really know you, I will point out that you haven't flown in an airplane in something like 20 years or something like that.
Yeah, it is 20. Yeah, 2004 was the last time I flew. Yeah.
Wow. So okay, so you're walking the walk.
Well, to a degree.
But you still live in a developed world, and you still have the lights on and all this kind of.
Yeah, and there's lots of other things. I mean, there's plenty of things that I do. I have too many bicycles because I do a lot of cycling.
It's so better than having too many EVs, I guess. But
yeah. Well, so there's lots of things I do that are completely inappropriate, and in a sense, by standing up and talking about these things, well, I've been innately hypocritical. But
I think we all, anybody working in climate, I think we're all in denial. We're all hypocritical.
But there are scale issues here as well that I think play out in terms of prestige. There are quite a lot of people I know who work on climate change who are, as soon as they become quite senior, their carbon footprint goes through the roof. Their consumption levels go to the roof. They buy a second home. They drive a big car. So the things that they normalize themselves. But remember, when you normalize the things yourselves, you're changing how you see the debate. So it colors how you as an expert talk about these issues. I had a colleague who was a very senior government advisor, won a prize on climate change, a climate change prize, and spent a significant amount of that money on a very powerful sports car, hydrocarbon sports car. Now, I think that really undermines how serious other people think climate change is as an issue, because they don't see us taking it seriously.
So, but staying on this, I think the way I would describe the overall sense of what you're saying is that we're not taking climate action seriously now. And I think but I would also say when we do, and I think we will try, because things are going to get worse and worse. And finally, unless there's other scenarios, but the good scenario is we have enough of the climate impacts in the developed world, because it's already happening in the global south, for example. They're getting hurt quite a bit by climate change already. But once it happens at home, and it's happening at home, but we still haven't faced up to it. Once we face up to it, we'll decide to take real climate action, which means seriously reducing emissions and all that kind of stuff. But I would argue at that point, we also then do solar geoengineering and CDR, carbon removal, because it's because even if we did reduction, let's say you get elected as president of the world, and you say we got to make societal changes and we have to cut our emissions, and we do. We already emitted 2.4 trillion tons, and even at a fairly fast pace down to zero, let's say 2050 or something, we're still going to hit 2 degrees at this point. And I mean, you could maybe argue a little bit, but it would be close if anything.
I think we're lucky. Likely be above. I think we're
likely be above. And to me, that's catastrophic right there, by the way. So I don't even, which is a whole other subject, are the targets we're shooting for even appropriate? But if that's true, we have to not let it go there, right? We have to try. And there are risks. You mentioned the risks of geoengineering, but what about the risks of not doing geoengineering? We actually understand those a little bit better, and we know they're like totally unacceptable as far as I can tell. AMOC collapse you just mentioned. The only thing that might, and it's only a might, stop that is stopping the freshwater inflow from Greenland. And the only thing that can do that in any time scale that's relevant is solar geoengineering. Reducing emissions at the fastest pace possible couldn't slow that down.
I think the language you use there is quite dangerous.
Okay.
The only thing we can do But so you've already made something that is just an idea. You've made it real, like it does exist. We
No,
don't
the
know.
only thing we can try. How about if I said the only thing?
But I think it's quite important. We have to make sure we talk about these things. We don't know if these things, they're very much, it would be an experiment. And if we start to use that language, I think then the public, the policymakers and others can start to think about these things more directly and honestly. But we talk about negative emissions as if these things exist. We don't have negative emission technologies at scale. There are a few pilot plants, but they're discussed about as if you can go down to the supermarket and buy one that will suck hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere. The way we use the language of geoengineering assumes we actually have the technology and the know-how and the understanding to go and refreeze the Arctic. I mean, that is not where we are. We are so far removed from that. So we have these ideas that the few experts are thinking about, are trying these things out. We have a few small pilot schemes here and there. And by giving the impression that these are mature ideas and technologies, I think we are misleading the debate. So I'm being careful here to say, I'm not saying we shouldn't be considering these things. I think we should. But the first thing we should be doing, the thing we should be doing that we do know works is do know is important. It doesn't solve the problems because we've put so much in the atmosphere now, but it is to stop digging, to stop putting more CO2 in the atmosphere. That is absolutely the first thing we need to be doing. But it's almost the thing that we don't discuss. So now we have the scenario.
We have net zero, which you said is Latin for kick the can down the road.
Yeah, so it's not about reducing emissions. The IPCC scenarios are not about reducing emissions. They're all about
delaying. It's about delaying reducing emissions, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not really whether we're going to reduce them then. It's only about how do we maintain business as usual today. So those scenarios are not about, we don't care if we delay it and then we have to reduce them in the future. We're not worried about the future. When we get there, we'll have come up with a new ruse to describe or to argue for delay. And then when we go on to the new point of delay, we'll do the same thing again. And that is what we've done repeatedly for 30 years, which is why every year so far, the emissions have continued to rise. There is no global reduction in emissions. Even coal, I understand, we burnt more coal last year than the year before. So we're still, across the fossil fuels, we're burning more of them year on year. Maybe peat is the one that we're actually starting to reduce. Even coal has gone up. I mean, it's just a ludicrous situation.
You talk about the risk, they don't exist, whatever. However, the plan that you suggest, which is to have societal changes, we didn't even get to it yet, but the rich reducing their emissions since they're responsible for so much and going down that path. So let's talk about the risks of that. So hitting 2C, like staying under 2C, I'm talking about if we pursue that, there's a risk, first of all, that we'll even try to do it. And obviously, so far, we haven't tried. And there's a risk that if we try to do it, that we'll succeed in reducing our emissions. We don't know. There's tremendous risks in that. Then there's the risk that even if we do reduce our emissions the amount you say, there's still a probability assigned to that 2C, which I would argue is probably very optimistic probability, 60% chance of hitting 2C with this carbon budget. And so now there's a risk of that. And then, of course, there's a risk that 2C itself would even be an acceptable number. Like, why are we shooting? Like, to me, it's a target that if we succeed, it's catastrophic. So perhaps that's not the right target. You know what I mean? So my point is there's tremendous risk at every level of even pursuing plan A of emissions reduction with societal changes. So if that's risky, I mean, and I would say the risk of geoengineering is small compared to that. I mean, we kind of know it worked because we saw it happen in 1991. I mean, with Mount Pinatubo. So you got to, what are your feeling of the risks of pursuing what you think has to happen? Like
I think we've got to be very careful of saying that the risks associated with reducing emissions somehow we start to categorize them in the same way as the risks of a future technology to suck hundreds of billions of tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere, or a future technology to refreeze the Arctic. These are not the same things. I think to classify those risks as the same thing, I think is fairly dangerous. Again, so now I think so. It's the language we need to use around these things. We are absolutely clear that if you reduce emissions, not reduce, eliminate emissions, then we are at a position at the moment where the science generally says if we could eliminate emissions today, which we can't, but let's imagine we could, then we probably would see some more warming, but not a lot more warming. Now, we could be wrong. I mean, other people out there say, and I think that's important to bear that in mind, and the public needs to be aware of this, and the policymakers need to be aware of that. It may be that we've crossed certain thresholds that mean we're going to see ongoing rises in temperature. If there is a appropriate way to look at this, the consensus of the science is probably that is not the case if we could eliminate them today. But we can't eliminate them today. The question then is, how fast can we eliminate them? And the longer it takes, the greater is the risk that we pass some sort of threshold.
Tipping point.
But we are absolutely clear. The first thing we need to be doing is reducing and eliminating our emissions as fast as we can achieve.
I agree.
And we do know that will have a big beneficial impact. We do not know with some of these other technologies whether we can even deliver hundreds of billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal. We don't really know whether geoengineering will. And I hear your optimism, but I hear that about lots of things. I hear about people thinking we're going to burn the amount of people that are working on BECCS, biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. They think, yeah, you say that, you sort of screw you. But these are experts in BECCS, of course, again, a technology we're not using at any scale. But they assume they're going to plant huge parts of the planet in some sort of biomass, grow the biomass, ship it around the world, burn it in power stations and bury the CO2 under the ground and thereby capture hundreds of billions of CO2. Now, you might screw your face up at that, but they think that's quite doable. But both their technology and your technology are ones out there in the future. We know how to. But
my point, though, is
they're different things.
They're different things, but they both have risk of achieving the goals. Your thing about, okay, the risk of reducing emissions is not, well, there is some technology risk there, whether renewables can be cheap enough, whatever. But let's say societal changes. It's not a technical risk. It's a psychological risk. It's a political risk. It's disinformation. It's propaganda. We know those things have prevented any meaningful action for 40 years. So why all of a sudden can we treat it as a non-risky approach to solving climate change?
No, there's no evidence to suggest at the moment we're going to do this. But part of that is that the expert community hasn't said we needed to.
So getting back to that, shouldn't the expert community, and you said they shouldn't use dire, but I mean, you feel it's dire. I mean, don't you think you should be honest in saying that? We had
no, I am honest. I do think it's dire. I think we're in a terrible situation now where the emissions are high. There's no sign of them coming down in the near term. The impacts that we envisaged occurring at higher temperatures look like they're starting to occur at slightly lower temperatures. So at every level, things get worse. We're continuing to emit more carbon dioxide. The size of the carbon budgets for any particular temperature look like they're smaller than we thought before. And the impacts we thought would occur at certain temperatures, on average, look to be occurring earlier. So every element of that layers on each other. And what you get is a much more serious situation. Layered on top of that, I stand back and look at the dialogue, the discussion that is had at the political level, and it is nowhere. There's virtually no serious discussion about this. Now, if you were looking for anything that things are there things that we can do? Renewables are incredibly cheap. So wonderful, great, renewables are cheap, but as I heard you say before, and I've said many times, the climate doesn't care about efficiency, which is cheap, about renewables that are now much cheaper than the fossil fuels. It only cares about are we burning the fossil fuels and the other greenhouse gases from agriculture and so forth. And so until we can control those, and that means rapidly substitute, then we're not moving in the right direction. But there is no intention at the moment to substitute between these things. So when a lot of the guests you've had and I've heard elsewhere, evoking technologies, the time frame to which they can be applied isn't in line with our carbon budgets. And this is why I come back to the other part of the debate, which is about the political aspects about rapidly reducing emissions through behavioral change. And I don't mean voluntary behavioral change, through regulations and so forth of the high emitters. That has to go alongside the technology. But that political discussion is simply absent because of the negative emissions, because of the geoengineering. Because we don't have to. The experts haven't said you needed to.
But the wealthy people are the ones who control the conversation. And I'm not too surprised they haven't put reducing our own emissions at the top of the list there. I mean, the wealthy control the media, the wealthy control politicians.
No. I've listened to the experts, the science experts in your program, and they never talk about these issues. So why would the policymakers, why would the public, why would the journalists? Because we don't.
No, I
And we
agree. I
don't
agree.
have to, because the IPCC and the other expert community have layered onto our futures all of these, at the moment, little more than unicorns and fairies about what's going to happen technically. And therefore, we have to ask these difficult, political, challenging questions. And
No,
so
I agree. I mean, that's why I got asked you about early about this hope versus fear message. And I think if
yeah,
you're being honest, you should be kind of scared of the future. And if people are scared, yeah, some of them will be turned off, but others will be motivated to act. And they're not motivated to act if you tell them everything's going to be fine. We'll use these future technologies to take care of it. I agree with
but
that.
again, but
But
that
that's
comes back to
separate
the
from
point.
actually using them to protect ourselves. That's a
Yeah.
different question.
But I say that I think it's very, very careful, very difficult for us, and something we have to be very careful about as the expert community in these things, is not to second guess whether fear or hope are the right emotions to drive change. Our job is to inform that debate. And if we are starting to question whether, so if I think hope is really, if say I think hope is really important, I'm not an expert on hope, but let's say I imagine for some reason I think hope is really important. I then start spinning a message of hope. Well, hang on, I'm not an expert on hope. So why would I be doing that? If I think fear is a big driver, so I start to spin a message of fear, I'm not an expert on fear either. The only thing I can do is make my judgment as to where we are heading and communicate that clearly. Now,
Well,
as I
don't you
say,
agree that that's scary where you think we're heading?
for
I think
me,
it's scary.
for me, it is scary, and I'm not trying to. That's why I think we have to be careful about layering things like some people would say in the really sort of doom-laden way. Well, I don't think that's appropriate, because I don't think that's what our science tells us. But I also think it doesn't tell us about this hope world either. It tells us what it tells us. Then we as individuals make our decisions on that. But unless the expert, come back right to the beginning of our conversation, unless we, the experts, are absolutely frank and honest about our judgments, then how on earth can we expect the policymakers or the media or civil society to engage in this debate? And we, the expert community, have been dishonest, have been, I mean, that's quite a strong term, but actually I think often that is true, about the scale of the challenge that we're facing and about how can we solve this with technologies. And often I realize that people who are promoting these technologies have never built anything in their life. They're a university engineer, a university scientist. They've never gone out there and tried to actually build something at scale and recognize that building something at scale is not a simple multiplication of a little laboratory experiment or a small pilot scheme. There are huge engineering and indeed scientific challenges sometimes about scaling things up, and then scaling things up really rapidly is even more challenging. And so we hear that so often about the technologies of the future, that we can just do it with nuclear. Have people really gone through and done the analysis how fast you'd have to build those nuclear power stations? And people say that, but the same for wind and for solar and for EVs and for all these other things. How fast can we build them? If you ask most people, just the other day, someone was talking about this it was on one of the social media channels about what we've done on electricity. And I pointed out, well, electricity is about 20% of what of the energy the world consumes. What about the other 80%? It was amazing how many people then said, oh, I'd never realized that. So people who were talking about these issues weren't aware that electricity was just a small part of the energy system. And of that small part, we've done some renewables in there. So you then start to think the scale of the challenges is completely different to what a lot of people are engaging with. And that's in part because we as the expert community haven't been honest and direct and clear in the challenges that we face. And going back to your point, and I know you're an advocate for geoengineering, and as I say, I mean, I'm not saying we should
because I listen to you, by the way.
yeah, well, yeah, and so we come to different judgments. But I think we have to be clear that those sorts of dialogues, and particularly negative emissions, less so the geoengineering, but that's the next route we'll go down after overshoot. We'll use overshoot, then we'll use geoengineering and SRM. The SRM, solar radiation management, will be embedded in the scenarios in the IPCC, so that will allow us to pretend we have larger carbon budgets so we can slow down mitigation today. That's how it will be used.
That hasn't happened yet, though, right? I don't think I
No,
haven't seen that yet.
But you and I know that will be happening soon, because the carbon budgets are so small, we can't no longer hold the myth and the storyline of the IPCC scenarios
Okay.
So we have to find some new thing there. We've already put in there hundreds of billions of tons of negative emissions. The next thing will be overshoot. So we'll then say 1.5, and then keep our fingers crossed, and there'll be an overshoot of 0.2 or 0.3 or half a degree or whatever it might be. And then the next bit after that will be geoengineering. So we'll embed the SRM in. And so that's the direction that we are going.
Okay.
Rather than actually saying at some point we have to actually rapidly curtail emissions, and that has huge global and national political implications, which we simply are unprepared to discuss.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I mean, I agree with you, by the way. I mean, we just don't want to talk about it, and it's obvious what to do. I mean, and supporting renewables, as we just found out, is not the same as getting rid of fossil fuels. If you get rid of fossil fuels, the renewables will take their place. But when you just support renewables, you get more energy, and that's what we have.
Yeah,
we don't have less fossil energy. We just have more renewable energy.
We absolutely have to phase out fossil fuels incredibly rapidly. And if you're looking for something, well, can we do that? Certainly the renewables, which are relatively quick to deploy,
right. We
can deploy them at much faster rates than we are today. And then we can use those to substitute for the fossil fuels. Now, there are some technical challenges in that, but I don't think many of those are insurmountable. But we can't do that fast enough to stay within anything like a 2 degrees C carbon budget, let alone 1.5 degrees C carbon budget. And that's why doing that, actively phasing out fossil fuels whilst rapidly deploying renewables, alongside that needs to go huge reductions in our energy demand by those of us who are the high emitters. And I heard, again, one of your interviewees the other day, and referring to, he said, "I've not been convinced by the analysis of degrowth." And then the rest of his interview was all really saying we need degrowth, at least those of us who are high emitters. And so there wasn't any analysis there. What he meant was the framing of the issues around degrowth aren't ones that fit with my political view of the world. And therefore, I'll pretend that I don't like the analysis. What he really meant was I just don't like the repercussions.
Right.
Analysis. That's what he really meant. But it was dressed up as he didn't particularly agree with the analysis. My guess is he hadn't looked at the analysis.
Well, speaking
the term
of that,
itself is unhelpful. Degrowth is an unhelpful term in my view.
So you've told me that we can't have very rich people and solve the climate emergency, or in a more simplified version, the rich are the cause of climate change, not you. And this is because of everything you just said. A technology-focused approach, eliminating emissions won't work. Can you just give us a high-level version of that analysis that says switching to renewables won't, I mean, just following the path of the energy transition while increasing energy won't work? Can you just lay that out a little bit?
The headline numbers are fairly obvious on this, is that that the top 1% of global emitters, who are not all in the global north, these include, there'll be lots of rich Chinese people and Indian people and Nigerian people that will be in that category. But so the top 1% of global emitters have carbon footprints that collectively are twice as big as the bottom half of the world population. Twice as big. I mean, it's just
1%.
It's mind-boggling that can be the case.
And the top 10% emit 50% of all emissions, I believe, is the other number.
Yeah, the other one is 50% of all emissions come from just 10% of the world's population. There are various ways to split these things out, but basically what it tells you, and there's repeated analysis to demonstrate this. You can all argue about the exact precision of these things, but the absolute clear message is virtually the lion's share of emissions come from a particular group, relatively wealthy group in our society, and that group, a lot of those emissions are discretionary. They do not have to have those emissions. The other people who are producing some of the emissions, a much smaller proportion. For most of those people, their emissions are not discretionary. A large proportion of those emissions are not discretionary. They're literally structurally locked into them by the low quality house that they have to pay to live in and rent in, by the poor public transport that's near them, by the fact is that an EV is really expensive, so they bought some older car that they can afford to drive. So they're structurally locked into relatively high emissions. And then what we cleverly do, we talk about everyone as if we're all in this together. We are not. The problem is driven by those of us who are actually significantly framing the debate on climate change. And it is being felt by those people who are less, who are not responsible for the emissions, or very small proportion of the emissions. So they're being felt initially by that group. And this other group of us just want to carry on business as usual and relatively, you may not like the term, but relatively hedonistic lifestyles. And the emissions data tells us this really clearly. And yet I've listened to more of your interviewees. I've listened to other people. I've listened to Hannah Ritchie just the other day. This way of framing is never brought out because it's too politically challenging, but it's what the data tells us. So people who tell us I'm data driven, that's not what they mean. They mean I'm driven by data that makes me avoid asking the difficult political questions. If the data drives me towards difficult political questions, I'll evoke a technology in the future, or I'll ignore the concept of time, quite an important element in data analysis. So when you put all of that together, it does say that you have to do all of the huge shifts technically, but you have to do that with big changes to the norms and the lifestyles of those of us who are responsible today for most of the emissions, historically have been responsible for quite a lot of emissions in the last few decades, and who frame the debate on climate change. But we don't do that because the experts are in that group. The experts we've been talking about before, we're in that group. So
they're in that group, and they get rewards and acknowledgement from the more wealthy than they are.
Yes, yeah. And so we have
grant funding and things like that.
Yeah. But again, I want to be sort of quite clear. I'm not talking about slight tweaks to the system here.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking about the technology, whether that's wind turbine, all the things that your colleagues have spoken about, which I'm often in agreement with, there are plenty of things we can do with existing technologies that we know how to do. The thing you require for those are both resources and labor. And so at this moment, we have a certain amount of resources and labor in our society. What are they being used for? Producing large Teslas, SUVs, large houses, private jets, planes where relatively people will fly regularly, but other people won't fly very often. That's where the labor and resources of our society are being put, or for mining the materials that go into the things that are disproportionately used by a small group of us. If we're serious about climate change, the labor and resources will have to go into building the wind turbines, putting trams in our cities and trains for wider public transport, for putting in huge amounts of renewables, for all of the electrical cables that we require for doing that, for decarbonizing our homes, our heating, our air conditioning, for doing that the same for our industry, doing all of that almost overnight. So we cannot have business as usual, the same sets of values and norms we have today, and address those issues. To do just the technology side alone will require this huge shift in resources and labor. This is not a political argument. This is simply a maths argument. You will not be able to have the shift unless you move those resources and labor across. And at the same time, you need to move them across anyway, because they cannot be held by that particular group of us who are responsible for the lion's share of the emissions. So both from an emissions perspective and from a technical sort of revolution perspective, you have to change those fundamental norms of our society. But we're not prepared to ask that question.
So when you talk about the risk of CDR and SRM, you say, well, we don't know them yet. They're so risky. It's so early. To me, the probability of getting the wealthy to actually do what you're saying is, I can't, again, maybe it's just me. It's hard for me to even imagine it. And they have so please explain your thoughts on the path to get there.
Well, as I said, I'm not hopeful here. I don't think we will do this.
But even theoretically, because if it's not even theoretically possible, then I don't know how much.
Well, I think it is. I mean, it is theoretically possible. I mean, and it's more than theoretically possible.
Okay.
For most people, even in wealthy countries, responding to climate change will, by and large, be good for their well-being and for their, and not at some point in the future. Now, almost immediately.
Agreed.
So and I'm going to talk here more about democracies that I'm more familiar with and some other systems. But within democracies, if actually our leaders were concerned about the well-being of the people, the constituents, the people they're supposed to be representing, then actually most people that they are representing would be better off if we seriously address climate change. They wouldn't be living in fuel poverty. They'd be living in houses they could afford to heat and live comfortably in. They'd be using good quality public transport. They may be renting smaller EVs for other activities. There would be good trains there. The air quality would be much better. Remember, it's the poor people that live in the parts of town where the rich people drive past, polluting the air. So if their air quality is better, their children's educational attainment will be better. There'll be more job security. So across the board, responding to climate change for those particular groups, the majority in our society, is actually plus, plus, plus. And by the way, it reduces emissions. The problem is it's not good for the small group of us who have disproportionately benefited from the well-being of us, from the productive capacity of our society. So that is a huge challenge. But if we think democracy is anything, then actually I think there is a route there. The trick of the establishment, and this is one of the reasons I think the experts have to be honest about this. The trick of the establishment, the trick of the way that we do things today, is to break everyone else up into individuals. As individuals, we have almost no power. As individuals come together, we have collective power that completely outweighs that of a president, of a Musk, of a Gates, or any of the other, any of these other people that look to have disproportionate power in our society. Their power resides in ensuring the rest of us are separated into individuals. And so you see often the most powerful people don't want unions in their companies. The last thing they would want is a union. They do not want people to actually come together. They do not want the dialogue about the poorer people in America are being kept poor and will suffer the impacts of climate change in terms of energy, in terms of increased costs of food and so forth, because the wealthy are again not creaming off, in fact, are taking the lion's share of the cake. That debate doesn't want to be opened up. The wealthy of us don't want that debate opened up. And yet, I think if the expert community on climate change started to open that up, you have to start to discuss these issues. The trick is we haven't had to discuss them because we have hidden behind future technologies. Now, I'm not saying it would be enough if we did this. Clearly, we're not the I doubt we're the linchpin in all of this. But, at least in my realm, my day-to-day job, if I'm going to have any integrity in that, I need to speak honestly and openly about these things. But I think our community hasn't done that. Now, it may well be if we spoke about it, others would as well. Perhaps we would see a significant change. And another, without looking for a thread of hope in this, but trying to observe other things that are happening. I don't know how you voted in the US elections.
But you can guess.
I can guess, yeah. And okay, I can guess. And I can guess the sorts of people who would vote, who'd voted for Harris. And I can imagine the people that voted over here for Brexit. They had their voices heard in the way that many of us don't like. And then we call it populism. We're really, I think, dismissive of them. And this comes back to my point about collectives, really, because we don't want to hear from these people, do we? We don't want to hear from the people living in the poor quality houses that have suffered, regardless of whether it's a Democrat or Republican government for generations. We don't want to hear in the UK how come Labour governments haven't given a damn about the poorer parts of our societies that were decimated when the mines were closed, that affected generations of children's attainment, of health, of well-being, of suicide rates, whether that's in the Rhondda Valley in the UK or the Northeast or some parts of Scotland where the industry was just decimated. The parties that claim to care about them haven't. Whether it's the Democrats in the Dust Belt in the States or over here in terms of the industrial areas, we see the same thing in Europe. So we see the rise of the right. We see the rise of what we so-called progressive lefties say called populism. I'm really pleased these people having their voices heard. My point here is that actually, if we could get them to debate on these issues, if we opened up our discussions here on climate change and we hadn't closed them down for 30 years, perhaps these people would start to think about these things. Perhaps we could be selling visions that were much more positive for them about responding to climate change. Instead, they've been sold fear and by people who want to oppose doing anything about climate change and mythical unicorn technologies in the future by the rest of us who are the experts on climate change. If we'd actually been more honest about this, we could have had a debate that spoke to actually really changing our society for the better, for all of us. But those of us who have done disproportionately well have not wanted that. So in the same way that we voted Harris or Biden, Harris or Trump rather, or Biden or Trump, I mean, from an emissions point of view, it's an irrelevance.
No, I agree.
It's the same over here. I mean, Labour come in, are they going to do much more than the Conservatives? We're talking about tweaking at the margins. The Inflation Reduction Act, which so many people thought about how wonderful that is. Look at the emissions embedded in it. Compare that with our Paris commitments, our carbon budgets and that. It's almost irrelevant. Biden signed off about as many permits, if not slightly more, on oil and gas than Trump did. There were some nuances in that. I appreciate that. But nevertheless, he was not holding the oil and gas in the ground.
No,
it looks
not
the
at all.
same here with the Starmer government. They're still letting the Rosebank development going in.
We had the Willow Project, yeah.
So all I'm saying here is that this this language of populism, the idea of people having their voices heard in a way that you and I may not like, actually is another thing that I think is a potential thread of hope, that if we engaged with those people and trusted them to think about these issues, maybe there would be people that would stand up against those of us who have deliberately manipulated the system for our own benefit.
But they ended up voting for the people that are doing that. And
But they had no choice. I mean,
well,
Harris and
well, no,
Biden.
my point is that the other message was fear of immigrants coming to steal your jobs, or the
Yeah,
fear of the price of eggs, or the fear of taking your SUV and the stove away. I mean, they used the message of fear. It worked, and it wasn't not a real populist message. It was the very, very wealthy using propaganda and disinformation and appealing to the baser instincts of people, and it worked. That's so.
yeah, no,
That's why I'm asking, like,
no, but I'm agreeing with you. But I think it's a bit different to that. I think it's
okay,
not that everyone voted. The fear that was used again in Brexit on both sides, and,
yep,
it, and
yeah,
and
yeah,
fear
yeah,
was
yeah.
used. Fear was used in the US election on both sides as well. All I'm
Not as
saying
much.
is that the people who had made a claim to care about the Dust Belt people in the States hadn't for a long time. So basically, if I was in the States and there's a choice between Trump, Harris, and an orangutan, I'd have voted for the orangutan. The other two have been the same with the Dust Belt communities. So I think we have to
And
be,
climate, by the way, I totally agree. Obama and Biden on net,
yeah,
even Obama improved fuel efficiency of cars, which has a rebound effect,
yeah,
so probably
yeah.
didn't do much of anything, and yet expanded fossil fuel production more than any president. And Biden, similar, a little different, but still on net didn't do anything for climate. So here's my theory. No, I'm sorry, a still possible silver lining on Trump. I'd like to see what you think. With Obama, Biden, and would have been with Harris, we would have a president that said they're doing something on climate, but they're really not, as you were
Yeah.
just describing. But with Trump, you're going to have a president that for sure won't be doing anything on climate and will say it himself, right? In the next 4 years, we're going to have all these climate impacts that would have happened no matter who was president,
Yeah.
and they will be getting progressively worse. Is it possible that having a president that says they're not doing something on climate when climate impacts accelerate might lead to more action after they leave?
I mean, it is possible, but I'm not going to sit back and let's find out. I mean,
There's
that's
another
my point
side to
about
that you get more authoritarian too, right?
yes. I mean, there's that side of it. I mean, my point about this is that we mustn't think that the power resides simply within these people.
Mhm.
That's my point about the power resides in democracies, in those of us coming together collectively to try to change things. And that doesn't just mean at the national level, it can be at the local level, it can be our school, our business, then at our local government level, at the state level, it can be then at the national level, it can then helpfully feed into wider international changes. Now, whether any of this is going to happen, I don't know. But when we continually break things down so it's just individuals, then you don't get informed collective action. And so I think the trick of the establishment is to always break it down into the individual. So I'm not waiting for Trump one way or Biden or Harris or any of these people over here, Starmer, to make the changes. We have to make those changes and discuss more widely. So Trump isn't, from a climate point of view, Trump doesn't look like certainly he's not going to be particularly interested in these issues. There are other things that he's going to be trying to address, and he will undermine some of the action
Democracy.
the Democrats would have liked to pursue. But nevertheless, the Democrats, if they had won, wouldn't have been aligned with Paris anyway. So I think we have to step back from that, and there have to be other ways to, if we are going to respond to these issues, there have to be other ways that we will respond to them.
Well,
All I'm saying,
protest is one of them, right? And
again,
in the
sorry?
UK, protest is one of them. And in the UK, they've responded to protest by making it illegal and locking up climate protesters for like a really long time, right?
There's nothing new in that. Every protest, if you go through history, whenever people have protested against something the establishment is locked into, one of the early responses is to lock them away. And so this isn't, that's no reason to give up. I mean, it doesn't matter
Okay.
whether you're looking at race or universal suffrage. History is awash with that. We lock people up.
True.
And so yes, that's part of that. But I mean, protest is really important. Activism is really important. But as well as that, I think for my community, so is honesty. And
Okay.
the honesty of the expert community, I think, is a key here because I think it opens up new ways of thinking. The trick is to close down new ways of thinking. So the only way you can think is a bolt-on technical business response to business as usual. But that isn't going to respond to climate change appropriately. It's not going to respond to the rest of the ecological challenges we face. And the other thing I think I'll just add on to all of this, because it goes back to the point we were discussing before about, which sounds deeply political, about the wealthy being responsible. That's what the maths tell us. Just look at the Gini index for countries. The Gini index is the index of inequality within our society.
Okay.
Yeah, the States is running at about 0.5, South Africa about 0.6, the UK probably, I don't know, 0.35-ish, I suppose. Scandinavia, at least some of Scandinavia, probably near 0.25. Yeah, and what you see from that is this huge inequality. The States has got worse in the last 30 years.
Oh, yeah,
Inequality
by
in
a
the
lot.
States has got noticeably worse. It's got worse in the UK, it's got worse in the EU, it's got worse globally. And so this deep inequality I was talking about before, whereby a small cohort of people are responsible for most emissions, actually this is getting worse. And my point here is that at some point, does it get to a level where it starts to break? And I would argue what we're starting to see with what us progressive lefties like to call populism in a patronizing way, I think is an early sign that maybe there is some tipping point that people are getting getting pushed so far they've simply had enough of this.
Mm-hmm.
And we hear the language in the UK, and I think I've heard this language in the States as well, like about austerity and cost of living crisis. I mean, there's no cost of living crisis. The UK gets wealthier every single year by a significant margin, but we then call it we're in a cost of living crisis. That language, repeated by the journalists and not opposed by the experts, allows us to put in place all sorts of policies that again just reinforce and accelerate the inequalities in our society.
Correct.
We need to step back and say the problem we have is not a cost of living crisis or an austerity crisis. What we have is an inequality crisis, where it's just getting completely bizarre that people can own as much money as the GDP of another country. I mean, it's just, and we normalize that.
Yeah.
No, not just we normalize it, we then sort of celebrate it.
Celebrate it, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Bill Gates writes a book on climate change. It's covered on our major sort of news channels over here. I mean, yeah, I've said this on Twitter. I mean, I'm guessing that Bill Gates knows as much about midwifery as he knows about climate change. But we don't think of asking him about midwifery. But because he's spoken on climate change, we are interested in what he's got to say. Why? Why are we interested in what he's got to say? And so at every level, we've created this very much two-tier world. And it plays out in terms of the emissions, it plays out in terms of the data. So that's why I come back to my point, is that you've got to start to ask these fundamental questions about where are society's resources and labour used, because they need to be reallocated to decarbonize our society. And that could be for the betterment of the majority of people, even in the wealthy parts of the world, let alone at a global level, which is, I mean, there's even deeper inequalities there.
Well, speaking of that, you formed a climate communications organization called Climate Uncensored. Link is in the description below, with Dan Caverly.
Calverley, yes. Yeah.
Caverly. And it's, quote, a nonprofit created to directly address the problem of climate action denial and delay. Through advocacy and research, we push for honesty and scientific rigor in climate policy. Please tell us about Climate Uncensored and maybe how people here can support it.
Okay. Well, Dan and I, a few years ago, we just sat talking about these issues like we're discussing this now. And we came to the conclusion that the expert community hasn't, exactly as we've discussed here, the expert community has sort of hidden the scale of the challenge and what the responses, I won't call them solutions, but what the responses might be. So we've parked them to one side, we've hidden them. And we felt it was important for us to try to and that's a process of censoring that has gone on. And sometimes deliberate, other times just because the way that we've normalized things and the value structures that the expert community has had. So we want to try to unpick these and try to just paint it really as it is, as to what the responses might need to look like. And we're not saying it's all about the social change. I mean, technology is a really important part of that, but technology and social change also go hand in hand. They're the sort of same thing. someone's got to pay for them. Someone's got to find the resources for them and the labor for them. And so we felt that there was a real scope for trying to unpick some of the numbers and particularly related to the Paris Agreement. So we took the Paris Agreement as our starting point. So, and we can have discussions on whether the Paris Agreement on the temperatures and the equity issues are appropriate, but we felt it was the global community in its very messy, emergent, and deeply unsatisfactory way, but nevertheless, it came up with a set of criteria, 1.5, 2 degrees centigrade, and to do this fairly. And then we felt it was our role, our job, because the expert community was not doing this, is to reveal what that actually means in terms of the scale of the challenge that we face. We don't have any particular funding for this, so it's been a challenge for us because we have to pay our mortgages and so forth. Now I'm employed as an academic, so I get that, so I take nothing from it. But Dan has a day job, and he's got to try to pay his mortgage and his rent, well, his rent in his case, and so that has been a challenge. So in fact, a lot of our time has been spent doing other things. So we provide a lot of evidence in legal cases where Dan's time we can charge for, but we have also spent some time. And you can see that on our website, trying to produce outputs, whether that's in terms of videos, whether it's in terms of animations about issues to do with carbon budgets, or some of the technical issues, or some of the equity and social issues. Some of the pieces that we've written, trying to unpick some of the numbers that are regularly used. So the UK saying, we're writing this piece at the moment, an 81% reduction by 2035 is in line with 1.5 degrees centigrade. I mean, nonsense like that. We're trying to unpick those sorts of numbers. And so we're trying to write this in a way that's accessible to the lay public, not to dumb things down, but to use a language that is accessible and understandable. So then if the public, civil society have access to this material, they can start to make their own judgments themselves. Because this is not, responding to climate change is not just about the experts. The experts are important in informing that debate, but actually the debate itself needs to be happening within civil society. But unless civil society is appropriately informed in a way that is not censored, then how can we ever expect society to do that?
Right.
And I would say, since we set this up, I think since we set climate censored up a couple of years ago, I think things have got worse. I think we're further hiding what is necessary. And
sure.
So that's why right at the beginning.
The climate, what's your feeling? I mean, like you, I've been calling for climate action for decades.
Yeah.
And I've noticed nothing happened at all until a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when climate impacts started being recognized as climate impacts, and they started accelerating, especially in the last couple of years. Now, it hasn't led to climate action, but it has led to a lot more discussion about climate action, I think. What's your feeling on climate impacts being the main motivating factor that might get us to move on climate?
Yeah, well, I think it's made us think about adaptation, and the us, let's be clear, it's made the wealthy think about how can we protect ourselves.
Yeah,
so it's
not those bunkers.
Yeah, that sort of mentality. So you see that to some degree I was recently talking in Spain, and obviously Spain had, they were pouring flooding in Valencia. That also occurred in other parts of Spain as well. But Spain's also had a GDP that's been growing, I think, slightly faster than the US GDP. So it's been quite successful economically in the traditional sense. And so it sees it again. I think it sees well, we can buy our way out of these problems. We can adapt to them because we've got the financial wherewithal. So I think the response to the impacts by the wealthy people who primarily cause those impacts at the moment has been much more about, we'll be okay. We'll have some problems, but we'll be able to buy our way out of those, and we'll be able to protect ourselves by and large from the most serious aspects of these impacts. I don't think it has driven an agenda that says, let's do something about it. Let's reduce our emissions. I don't think it has driven that at all. And that's not to say it couldn't do that, but that again comes down to those of us engaged talking about these emissions, talking about the challenges, I think, more openly and more honestly and more politically. And I mean that politically because it is a political issue.
Oh, 100% political issue, right?
But
I mean, it's a political issue. It's a science issue. It's a technology issue. It's an everything issue. It's all encompassing.
It's not political in the sense of just adjusting business as usual. So a lot of the time when people say it's political, what they mean is we've got to move money and spend more money on renewables. We've got to spend more money on EV charging. We've got to spend more money on heat pumps. That's what a lot of people talk about as political. It is far, far deeper than that, what the political change that is necessary. It's embedded in our values, in our norms, our expectations and anticipations. And all of those sorts of things that we think have been human for years, but are not. They're all relatively new, about that somehow that every year we should be wealthier than we were the year before.
Know, right.
Infinite growth going on forever, that we sort of hand out Nobel Prizes for economists who say that's the way we should go. So we have this
terrible.
So we've got to step into that challenging political realm, as well as, we need to fund more wind turbines and more solar panels and more trams and more EVs and charging, all those other things that we may be thinking about or not thinking about, those technology responses. There's the other bit that's much more deeper and political. And that debate, I think, is still, we're simply not prepared to open it up. No one asks me, you're doing it today, but virtually no one asks me to talk about those other sets of issues. And I know it's most of the interviews you have, they virtually never. No, I think that's fair. Unfair. I think they never, I would say, go as far as that. They've never brought these issues up. It's always about the politics to do with technology, never about the politics of values and norms.
Well, speaking of politics, we kind of touched on this a little bit before, but the Paris Accord set temperature limits as sort of the goals, the 1.5, which we're at now, on our way to 2, and that's the other goal. And so the framing of the targets is to prevent going over those temperature limits. But, if we went to 2.1 instead of 2, it sounds okay, and that allows us to squeak into 2.2. And therefore, we're not doing anything, as we've talked about today, to actually meet those targets. But we talked about the AMOC collapse, which, by the way, our guest next week is also about how the IPCC calculations were wrong, and it's slowing down faster than the calculations show, and we'll get into that next week. But all the research in the last year, and it's really just came out of nowhere, right, is that we could have a shutdown that begins before 2050. It might take 10 to 100 years to actually shut down, but once it's going, it's, as you said, catastrophic, and without going into all the details.
Yeah.
But my question is AMOC collapse perhaps a better framing than 1.5 and 2C, because it's a specific thing that happens or it doesn't happen? It's like there's no 2.1 degrees for AMOC collapse. It's very near term. In fact, it's really the same time frame as 2C, really. And you can lay out, people don't understand yet, but you can lay out really catastrophic outcomes that are forever. There's no going back. It's not like you can then use SRM. Well, you can use maybe SRM to do a few things, but it's like less rainfall in the entire northern hemisphere. Europe, obviously, northern Europe is devastated. It becomes northern Canada. Sea level rise, Hansen says, if it goes there 10 feet plus by the century, a lot of bad things. Is that a better framing to focus on? Because it's, in some sense, again, being honest here, it's still risk. It's still risk that it's going to happen. We don't know for sure, even though the probabilities are exceeding 50% of it occurring by 2050. It's pretty crazy. So what's your feeling on using that as a framing target as opposed to the 1.5?
Yeah. That's something I thought about over a long time, regardless of AMOC. AMOC makes it, adds to that process of thinking about these things. 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, they're just proxies for impacts. So what we're interested in on climate change, and I think we often miss this, and I hold myself, as responsible as a lot of other people. The expert community again focuses on these bizarre things like staying below 1.5 at a certain probability, or staying below 2 at a certain probability. And this is meaningless claptrap to most people. And we actually ourselves forget, I think, sometimes that these temperatures are just proxies for impacts, and they're not really even just impacts. It's about the rate of change of impacts. So if impacts occur over thousands of years, even many hundreds of years, human societies and ecosystems can evolve with those. And of course, that's what happens all the time. That's the dynamic processes of life on Earth. The problem is if they start to occur very rapidly, and that's what is happening now. I mean, these things are starting to occur almost within the blink of an eye, from a geological point of view, even shorter than that probably, but from even an ecosystem point of view, from a human system point of view, we've grown up. Modern humans have grown in the last 10,000 years or so in a climate that's basically stable. And then we've now got a huge population. So we for years and years ran with a very small population that was bordering on extinction. And then over the last 10,000 years, we've got, greater and greater population. And now we're in a point where our norms and our behaviors are changing the climate to a point, well, actually human populations have never lived with this. And most other ecosystems have never lived with this rate of change. And that was bad enough as it was. We're looking at the impacts that we were traditionally looking at. But now we layer on top of that AMOC, which looks catastrophic. It's not a small adjustment. It's a huge issue that for a while was thought to be very low probability and a long way away, and now looks to be much higher probability and a lot nearer and catastrophic. So I think there is something in this that we need to find ways to communicate these impacts. And probably we're talking about AMOC. I spoke about AMOC earlier. There are probably people listening to this. What on earth is this AMOC thing? It's always hard. The second word,
Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or the ocean conveyor belt that brings heat from the tropics to northern Europe.
Yeah. That? So basically, from the southern part of the Atlantic, and that process has been absolutely key in the development of humans and agriculture and food systems and where our cities are based and all of those things, and therefore our culture over the last very, very long period of time. And now it's the increasing evidence is that almost overnight we're going to change this. At a level that could mean that Europe could be 10 or more degrees colder than it is today. I mean, the temperature difference could be huge. I mean, it'd be utterly
20 C in Norway kind of thing, minus 20 C.
Yeah. So utterly devastating. And of course, it will also play out in other weather patterns around the world, which will play out in terms of access to food. But it'll change that in the agricultural norms, what can be grown, where it can be grown, at what level can it be grown, the yields, that will play out into terms of droughts and all those. So at every level, catastrophic. And so maybe actually just talking about these things is a more helpful way to bring people into discussions about this. But this sort of plays back to my point that we haven't discussed it today, but I've said it on many occasions, that whilst people like me and you and others, the experts chat to each other in the way we're talking today, or we use PowerPoint presentations, this isn't how most people engage. Most people won't be tapping into this interview. Other people engage in these issues this is the language we breathe and live and breathe, fine. But this isn't a way to communicate with the public. The language of AMOC isn't a way to engage with the public. And so I think we do need to think about how do we bring other people in who are much better at thinking about these issues and communication experts, and they will help us to think differently about this. It's not as if they just come in and communicate what we say. There's a dialogue that goes on there, a process of understanding that goes on. But I don't think you or I are ever going to convince the public that AMOC is a really important issue.
No, by the way, I 100% agree. And that's why on this show, we bring in folks like David Fenton and Adam McKay and others who specialize on how to reach the public. I see this as a place where the people, sort of the trainers thing, like get people who are engaged in climate to get them really knowledgeable about what's happening so that they're in a better position to reach the public if that's what they do, or get people. By the way, but imagine if everyone was going around talking about how worried they are about the AMOC collapsing. Just the public. If the public was doing that, the politicians would have to respond to that.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, they're not responding now.
No, but I think also what you said there was interesting because, I don't want to pick on anyone in particular, but you mentioned Adam McKay, Don't Look Up.
Don't Look Up. But he also has Yellow Dot Studios, which is trying to directly communicate to the public with short form, generally funny messages. Yeah.
No, there's some great work that's out there. I like some of the juice media stuff, if you don't mind. Quite direct language, Australian direct language. I mean, some of that's really excellent. But all I'm thinking about the Don't Look Up and those sorts of discussions, I still don't think that they in those engage in the point I was saying before about how inequality is a huge driver of climate change. Yeah.
Well, the whole message at the end was that the super wealthy took the spaceship to the other planet. to get away
Yeah.
and leave everyone else behind. I mean, that was a little bit of a Doctor Strange.
Yeah, you get that, but then you also got the DiCaprios playing the scientist pulling his hair out. So it's a very double.
He was playing you. No,
Hmm?
he was playing you. No, just kidding.
But no, but in a sense, if you're the public listening to this, there's something that undermines the credibility of that when you get someone who's on the sort of pinnacle of obscene material and energy use and carbon emissions, who's playing the role in that. And I think that's a challenge. So
I don't know. I've heard this criticism before of it, but I would just say, hey, look, he was trying. He made for what the message was not inequality. The message was politicians ignore climate change, and they did a wonderful job. In fact, there was these protesters in the UK who were arrested, and they were on TV, and someone took that interview and put it right next to the interview in the movie, and you could not tell which was real. I mean, they were commenting on the woman's dress, what she was wearing. And you couldn't. It was mind blowing to see. So from that point of view, he succeeded in showing a certain aspect. You got to remember that this is going up against everything else you're talking about, the rich flying around and doing all this crazy stuff.
Yeah, but I think this is the point.
That's we should be criticizing that, not
yeah. But if the DiCaprios of this world came out and said, actually, I think this is really serious.
He does. He has documentaries.
No. Hang on. Sufficiently serious that I'm going to make some significant changes. Not buy a bloody Tesla and put some solar panels on one of my houses. I mean, that's not taking anything seriously. So if he took and as someone who's as bright and sharp as DiCaprio, to recognize that, and I need to talk about this openly and vociferously. I will start to talk about how I'm starting to use the tube, how I'm starting to use public transport. I know that might be challenging for some stars, but start to talk about the changes that he has made because he has started to understand how difficult these things are. But when you've got the Schwarzenegger saying, I think climate change is really important, that's why I bought myself a 400 horsepower hydrogen Humvee. That locks in.
Except, let me. By the way, this is deserves a whole hour, so I'll just go back a tiny bit on this one. Supposedly British Petroleum came up with the idea of the carbon calculator so that you could calculate your carbon footprint, so that we could shift the blame for climate change on you, and it's not me, British Petroleum. And I'm working with some groups trying to get musicians to speak out more on climate, to be more direct. And this is a big problem because they do have big carbon footprints. They're flying to concerts and things like that. And this whole carbon footprint thing that you're bringing up is a big thing that stops them from engaging on it because they feel guilty. But the real reason is, as you said, it's structural. I mean, that's the way society is built. If we had policies that required the phase out of fossil fuels, period, and other things that you're suggesting, they would happen. Yeah.
These people are not neutral in this. We are now talking about the small suite of people right at the top of the system. So they are the people that in various ways will color the political debate. And that's why I'm saying that the DiCaprios of this world have that opportunity, but their arguments might be valid, but their credibility is undermined because everyone looks at what they're doing.
Walking the walk, talking the talk. Yeah.
And so I think they need to start to do that much more. And on the music side,
but I think there's a problem with that, though.
On the music side, I have a colleague, Professor Carly McLaughlin in Manchester, who's been working with Massive Attack, a really major band, and they're looking at, they're not looking at tweaks to the system, so they are trying to walk the talk. They're trying to make major changes to how they run their concerts, about the travel of the people that come to the concerts, about how you power those concerts, about massively reducing the amount of materials that are required to run the concerts. At every level, they are trying to do that. And no doubt someone can turn and say they're quite hypocritical, but they're not tweaking it at the margins. They are fundamentally going back to first principles and saying, how on earth do we run as a high profile band? How do we run major music industry concerts and so forth and respect issues of climate change? And they're really trying to push the music industry very hard on this, but it is not about tweaks. And the point about me bringing this up, you're talking about the music industry, is that they are demonstrating it through the changes they are trying to make and the engagement they are having. So they are engaging with select committees in the House of Commons, with the media, and with the academic expertise. And so with my colleague Carly McLaughlin and Massive Attack coming together to talk about these issues. There's a whole lot in the media now discussing these things.
Mm-hmm.
But my point there is about the credibility of the arguments comes out or is reinforced by Massive Attack trying things that are really difficult.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
by the way, the group I'm working with is doing exactly what you're saying too. I mean, they're trying to change the way the concerts run, how it's powered.
Yeah.
They're trying to do all of that too, but it's that is incremental change. They're trying some big things. They're trying to make it all renewable and whatever, but people still will fly in but my point is that when the focus is on the individual, the blame is on the individual. And you're saying the wealthy as a group is maybe a little bit better to blame, but when it's on the individual, rather than British Petroleum, it's really the structural problem we have. You can't live in a world without using fossil fuels today because of the policies that we have, which allow.
Well, there were lots of it. I mean, we discussed this earlier, so let's go back to the point about. I accept this idea of breaking things down into the individual. That's the way, regardless whether it's on climate change or any other issue for that matter. That is a way the establishment protects itself.
Yeah,
because you do not want the rest of the majority of people who actually hold the power if they came collectively together. You don't want them to have the power, and you break that power by making sure they're all seen as individuals. But I think that starts to break down when you're starting to talk about the Gates, the Musks, the Leonardos, the presidents. These people, they are much closer to driving, if you like, the political change that would be necessary to put in the policies to curtail the BPs, the Shells, the Exxons, Chevrons, and so forth. But I think that group is not pushing this issue hard.
By the way,
a few exceptions.
Another hour discussion. So, but Gates for sure, and I believe DiCaprio, I may be wrong, are offsetting their emissions. Gates actually wants the Microsoft back to 1974 through carbon removal. By the way, not just planting trees, right? And so they are doing that. And I don't know what your thoughts on that, but
worse than doing nothing would be my thoughts on it.
Really, carbon removal, paying for carbon
absolutely
removal?
Worse than doing nothing. Because he's not doing carbon removal. He's doing something to say it's perfectly reasonable to have a handful of private jets and fly around the world regularly with those. If we can, because I, a multi-billionaire for selling a beta quality product, have the funding to do that. Now, if you think carbon removal is important, fund the carbon removal and use that to cover perhaps the fuel that's used for operating theatres and hospitals, not to cover the jets of flying Gates to one of his numerous homes around the world.
No, but to be fair, he's actually paying for the past emissions of Microsoft. Microsoft is doing it.
He's also, when I heard him interview,
past emissions.
He was also talking about doing it to cover his own emissions.
Right, which I think are small compared to Microsoft, of course, but yeah.
But they might be small compared to Microsoft. But all I'm saying is that the value structures he's putting in again are that the wealthy can buy their way out. So he's not an emitter. I mean, this is part of the problem, not part of the solution. So fine. But I would also say, why is it that he or these sorts of people have so much money that it's them that's funding the CDR research and the other research out there, and not governments? Where's the democracy in that? I mean,
I agree.
There's no democracy in this. And so there is something in this, again, that we're using, if you like.
Well, government's doing some now, right? And Trump signed it, by the way, which was interesting. The 45Q tax credit in the United States was signed by Trump. That was the first thing to pay for anything for carbon removal. Yeah. And Biden increased it, but
the reason and I have said this on social media in the past, my concern about when these incredibly wealthy, very, very high consuming individuals, we're talking about hundreds to thousands of tons a year per person. So, compared to the average in the States, 14, 15 tons.
Yeah, something 15 to 20, something I thought.
Something like that. And of course, that will be driven by the high emitters. So if you look at the median,
right. So the mode would be
much, much lower. The median would be a fair bit lower than that as well. And a lot of those people, the people with the median emissions in the States, are probably structurally locked in, but the people like the Gateses aren't. And the problem is that they are effectively saying we can normalize these very, very high consumption lifestyles through things like offsetting, through things like carbon dioxide removal, rather than you've got to make structural changes to our society to respond to these issues.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they are deeply part of the problem. And I don't really care how much CDR he funds. I think he is much more problematic in reinforcing the status quo than he is in actually changing it.
So we've been having a great discussion. I've been kind of skipping over so many questions here that I have, but I do want to open it up for the audience. And by the way, audience members, if you're on YouTube, please post your question in the comments. Put the word question in front of it so we can try to find those. If Stacey, I'm not done yet with I have two more questions to go before I get to those. And then, but if you're on Zoom, put your in the comments, and if you're on Clubhouse, put them in the comments. Okay. So with that, kind of along the lines of what we said, I first heard about you in 2010 when you did your Beyond Dangerous thing. And there's a quote that I memorized, but I still have it written down. Came from you because you mentioned before that 2 degrees and 1.5, they're not the things themselves. It's what happens at those levels that we have to worry about. And you said of 4C, which you could argue there's certainly a risk of hitting that century or certainly next century, no question, on the path we're on without the action that we need to take. You said then in 2010, quote, there is a widespread view that a plus 4C future is incompatible with an organized global community, is likely beyond adaptation, is devastating to the majority of ecosystems, and has a high probability of not being stable. In other words, 4C would be an interim temperature on the way to a much higher equilibrium temperature. Consequently, 4C should be avoided at all costs. So my question is, do you have any update or further thoughts on that comment you made 14 years ago?
Well, I think it was valid then, and I think it's valid today, more so in some respects. You might, from the understanding that we have about the impacts that we thought might occur at these higher temperatures look like they're occurring at lower temperatures. Some of them are, not all of them, because they're much more complicated suite of these things. But on average, if you like, quite a lot of the severe ones look like they're going to occur earlier. So if I was to change anything in that, I'd probably reduce the temperature.
Call it 3, which we're certainly
well, yeah, call it 3. But I mean, if you listen to the discussion we had before on AMOC,
that's 2.
It perhaps is 2. And this, so, yeah, and then it comes down to what those chances. I think most people are, well, from what I hear from the experts on things like AMOC, so Ramsdorff's to this world, and there are others out there as well. I think if we head into these higher temperatures, 3 degrees centigrade, then there's a very, very high chance that that the AMOC is going to change dramatically. And so I think that then the temperatures like 3 degrees centigrade, that would hold to that statement I've said there. As we discussed earlier, if AMOC does significantly shift, and will effectively switch off, significantly weaken, the implications are catastrophic. And I think in any way we can imagine. I mean, the only people that will come out with something positive about that, some economists will work out something via some strange discount rates that will, say that'd be really positive for the well-being of society, and they'll probably win a Nobel Prize for it. But for everyone else who's thinking about these issues, that simply isn't the case. And so I think that temperature is probably a lot lower, somewhere between 2 to 3 degrees now. And it may well be that the more we understand on impacts, on some of the issues about dieback, some of the other, away from AMOC, some of the other multiple issues we look at, the sort of work that Tim Lenton, Rockstrom, and others have looked at in terms of other sort of planetary boundaries, whatever language you might want to use around these things. I think we have to be careful not to use too much precision around them, but these other things that are there, that many of those look like they're occurring at 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. So maybe even 2 degrees centigrade now is becoming somewhere between 2 and 3 looks, is where 4 was then. But I think there is also some evidence that even 2 is looking incredibly challenging.
Okay. Well, kind of speaking of that, I again have so many questions. We have to do this again to cover them, but I want to get back to the solar geoengineering because it kind of relates directly to this. But you mentioned about the moral hazard, that it's an excuse for inaction, and it's being used as such today. So that's what I'm saying. One fear of solar geoengineering, that it's a moral hazard. It could suppress efforts to phase out fossil fuels. But many people, especially in the global south, are suffering from climate change today. And they will suffer more while we perhaps get around to phasing out fossil fuels. And even if we actually did phase out fossil fuels, the global south will continue suffering while climate change gets worse until we reach zero emissions. We talked about things could happen anyway, tipping points, and things will never get better for them. Considering that solar geoengineering, with assuming more studies to check it out, we're not doing it tomorrow, may provide near-term relief from climate change impacts and prevent irreversible tipping points such as AMOC collapse, maybe. Isn't it a moral hazard not to seriously study and consider deploying it?
Well, I did say at the beginning, I was quite clear in my language. Yeah, let's study it. So I'm not saying don't study it. And if we were absolutely confident that it wouldn't have other detrimental impacts, it may be appropriate for it to be deployed. But let's also be quite clear. The last thing I would want to, as you're talking about the global south, rich high emitters in the global north carry on emitting and say we'll do some geoengineering to help the global south. I think we have to be very careful about that colonial approach. If the global south chooses to do it, yeah, the global south chooses to do it. If that's the ones we claim to be worried about, which I don't think we are, but if we claim to be worried about them, if they choose to do it, maybe that adds a certain different dimension to it. But I'm very concerned about us high emitters carrying on in the global north and then doing this under the guise that we're concerned about the global south when we're carrying on with our high emissions.
Yeah.
That would be
I want to get back to
problematic.
something you just said, though. You said as long as it doesn't have negative side effects. Let's assume it does have negative side effects. In fact, of course, it will have negative side effects. It might disrupt the monsoon or something, or do something. It will shift pattern. I mean, it does when Mount Pinatubo goes off. It changes growing patterns.
Yeah.
It for sure will do that. But that's not the question. The question is, what are those negative side effects compared to the negative side effects of not doing it, which I would argue are at least 10 times worse. And we know it, right? That's what we're spending this hour and a half talking about.
But you're making that point. You're in the global north. So if I'm hearing that point from people in the global south, then I'm much more interested in what they've got to say. Because we don't really care. We're carrying on our lifestyle. We're carrying on our high emissions. So we're carrying on that. So let's not pretend. I mean, I'm not picking on you or me, but as a collective whole, we don't give a damn about the global south. We haven't done for a long time. We've demonstrated that with our collective failure. Now, and I don't mean everyone in that, but collectively, we've demonstrated that we don't care about them. So let's not have a pretense now that we do care. So if the global south choose to pursue some geoengineering options because they think it's appropriate for them, then that's a decision that they can make. And I rather hope they would engage with us on this because it would have impacts for us. But if it's the other way around, the high emitters in the global north think we can carry on with our high levels of emissions and consumption, and don't worry, we can solve that by geoengineering and using the global south as a reason for doing it. That is deeply problematic to me. So if I'm hearing the arguments you're making coming from the global south, perhaps to me, they would hold greater legitimacy.
But I've actually heard that they do. Of course, obviously, very few people actually talk about geoengineering. It's a small group that does, but I have heard that, and not enough to confirm it, but that there is interest in the global south of getting relief. And,
yeah, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there will be, but I mean, as I say, it's their responsibility to think through these issues, and maybe in the end they say that's the right way to go. But I think we have to be very careful because that's most of the people. If you go to any of these geoengineering conferences, even carbon dioxide removal conferences, it won't be awash with people from the global south. It won't be awash with global experts in the global south. It won't be awash with those scholars. It'll be awash with high emitters from the global north saying we should use geoengineering because we're concerned about the global south. Now,
well, I'm going to try to work. We had Dan Kamen on recently, and he works in Africa all the time trying to promote renewables, and he's there working with them, and we talked about that a little bit. But I agree. By the way, I agree with you, and we have to increase that discussion. I'll see if you have suggestions for people to talk to down there.
I've got to
bring them on. I'd love
Yeah.
to have them on.
Yeah,
So
there's quite a few out there.
let's we've again could talk to you for another hour and 45 minutes. Want to bring in questions. Stacy, welcome. Sorry for the delay there. We were just kind of going at it there, so it was really good. So.
Yeah, and I mean, Kevin, thank you again for coming on. I so appreciate your perspective. It's been an excellent conversation. I would also say we kind of have to do like an after hours or another chapter of this. This has been the richest discussion in terms of comments on YouTube. I can't keep up with what everyone has been asking. I mean, before you even called for questions, I already had too many questions that we could even ask. So yeah, there's a lot here. And one thing I wanted to say in defense of our program, we have both climate scientists and those who work on solutions here, and perhaps they cross over more than they should. But I feel like, I don't know, we've been pretty good about saying who does what, but maybe you could give us offline some suggestions for how to do that better. I agree with you that the developed world, and namely the US, is the problem. Every time I hear something about, oh, we're doing this now, it's like, it's all still up there. It's all still up there. We don't get, it doesn't reset every December 31st. It's all still up there. And we ignore that. And again, like you have mentioned, we keep carrying on as normal. But I did get kind of intermixed in terms of what we do as individuals and what has to change overall. I mean, it all has to change, like both. But I get uncertain about how to do it. How do we change absolutely everything? I mean, I'm this person, you know, like you and I live very similar footprint lives. I get it, but I don't know how to have everyone else wake up and do the same. How do they modify their lives? How do they modify business? How does everything change, especially when we need the policies in place to make it easier? And look what the biggest problem in the world just did. Do you have some advice for how we might go about changing everything?
This is the sort of argument that you hear a lot about. What's your theory of change? It's not, and I don't particularly like the question. It's not because I don't like the answers, but it's because I don't think there is an answer. If you're looking at small adjustments, then we can all come up with various theories, and perhaps some have more validity than others. If you're facing something that we're looking at now, where you're talking about sort of much more fundamental, profound change occurring very rapidly, I think we have very little experience that gives us a nice theory of change. And then this isn't meant as a cop-out, but all I feel that I can do, and indeed this also feeds into my recommendations for others, is to be honest and direct. As an expert on reducing emissions, I don't have expertise in other things, just really in that. On that part, I have to be just honest and direct and make sure people don't misunderstand what I say, regardless of what my paymasters think, regardless of whether that makes me liked or disliked, regardless of what that means in terms of prestige or payment or whatever that might be. That is my job as an expert. And I think that's the job of all of us in this realm, to talk honestly from our expertise. There is another part of this, that as an individual, I don't think individual actions, by and large, matter in isolation. Well, I'm sure that they do not matter, even from the Bill Gateses of this world. What matters, though, is that we try to make the changes ourselves, and then we discuss that with others. That debate, and Dan and you, that's exactly what you're doing. You're opening up that debate. But that debate is lent credibility by trying to do things ourselves. It doesn't change the veracity, the truthfulness of our arguments, but what it does do is lend credibility to them. And there's a wealth of social science research and psychology research to show that when people are trying to do something themselves, and when they talk about that through their arguments with others, those arguments have greater credibility. They're not changed, but they have greater credibility because the person is trying to make the changes themselves. I mean, you might say this is sort of, this is obvious. If you go to If you go to the doctor and the doctor's smoking and they're telling you to stop smoking, then you don't take as much notice as if the doctor said to you, well, actually, I've been trying to stop for a long time. I found it really hard. It's really bad for my health. It's bad for your health. You need to try as well. Then you would have greater sort of sense of the doctor's in this with me. So there is, that's a common sense view, but there's plenty of psychological evidence that shows this is the case. So as an individual, try and change things ourselves, talk with others about it, talk with our family, our friends, our communities, use social media, use things that the programs like you two are doing here. It is, and I don't think we can expect more than that. It might be uncomfortable for us sometimes, and other people will choose different routes. They'll listen to this and they'll become activists in the way that they'll go and put their bodies in the way of things and try and change things. That happens. And we know historically that has been a really key part of driving change. And they are ridiculed by the establishment. They're ridiculed by the press. They're ridiculed by the mainstream of that particular day. But ultimately, those sorts of people drive change. And I would argue that this sort of program, these discussions we're having now, are part of that process. And I don't think we can expect any more of ourselves than that, is to be open. And that does risk us being criticized. But when we talk about what we're trying to do ourselves, we are opening ourselves up. We are laying ourselves bare for other people to rip into us. And I think we have to do that. And we have to support other colleagues who do that. Even if we don't support their views, we have to support them to stand up to be counted. And so Dan and I obviously have quite different views on some of the things to do with geoengineering. The point is to be honest about what we're doing there, to discuss these issues. And there's difficult issues like we did before that are challenging, that we've got two elderly white men in the global north talking about geoengineering because it could be good for people in the global south. That is a difficult thing for us to do. It's uncomfortable. I mean, Dan, I'm sure, feels uncomfortable about it. I feel uncomfortable talking about it as well, but we have to open up these dialogues. And so it is about integrity, honesty, and humility, and trying to do good things ourselves, recognizing that we will be criticized for doing them. But doing those things and then talking about them openly and vociferously and in an engaged manner. And that, I don't think policy is top down. So a lot of people see the world as a triangle, and policy is bestowed on the little people beneath by the very clever people at the top. It's a much more messy, complex network than that. And so I don't think we know where change comes from. We don't know where the policies will emerge from. And when we make changes ourselves, they'll be changed by someone else. So Dan talks to me and you talk to me, and that will change how I think, and I'll talk to someone else. And those things morph through the system. So I see change as much more emergent out of that messy network of people. And the greater degree of honesty and clarity that we can put into that network, the better is the chance of informed emergent policies coming from it. And that's why I'm less interested when we talked about the Gateses or the Musks, or I'm not worried about Trump or Starmer or these other people out there trying to delay action. They're not an irrelevance, but I don't think we should bestow them with great power. They only have power because we have given it to them. And I think we can take that back ourselves if we have a different view of how the world operates. And I say it's a much messier emergent network. So that's how I see it.
And you work with Greta Thunberg, and she's an example of someone who took individual action and built it into collective action. And
very much so. I mean, I've used Greta before for this. Perhaps I get a bit old hat to use it now, but if you went back, you have to go back further now. If you went back 6 years, I think 6 years now, and said, who do you think will be the person that catalyzes a change in the debate on a wider level of engagement? You wouldn't have said, I think it'll be a 15-year-old Swedish schoolgirl. That isn't the person. You'd have thought it would be some sort of Obama type figure or some other great and good figure. Instead, it's someone that emerges, out of society. And there lots of clever people afterwards say, well, I thought that was going to happen anyway, but none of us did. No one thought it was going to be a 15-year-old schoolgirl. And she's not going to solve global problems. She's never made that claim herself, but she's opened up a debate in a way that it wasn't opened up before. And that might be one of you. So it could be a listener to this program now. It might be that next person that does that in their community that then triggers something else within their state that might then trigger something that occurs at the national level.
Mm-hmm. Very good. So,
okay.
Stacey,
so we'll go about upsetting the world order.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
yes, yeah.
And then Dan, we should go to Eli, and then whatever you want. I mean, I have some
other questions. Again, everyone, rather than coming up on stage, just post them in the comments on Zoom, YouTube, or Clubhouse. And Eli, welcome. What's your question for Kevin?
Thanks. So this has been trodden in slightly different ways, but I'm trying to ask a very direct question about how the discourse among people involved in climate action circles could be changed or might address this. So among those involved in climate action, there's historically been skepticism of technological solutions, both reasonably and less so. Given that we face amplifying feedbacks, underestimated risks, and breach of planetary boundaries on present trends, considering there's a potential risk net zero would not by itself be adequate, what are your thoughts on revisiting the role of technology development and deployment to face the challenges confronting us and specifically to create a sustainable civilizational infrastructure? And I'm referring to, in part, your tweet of David Spratt's report a few days ago.
Okay. Well, as an engineer, perhaps I'm biased on this, but I think technology is absolutely key. I try to come at it more neutrally than that, really, and try to be relatively technology agnostic where I can be. I think if we think we're going to respond to climate change without major shifts in technology, rapid deployment of different technologies, then I think we are deluding ourselves. Technology is absolutely a key prerequisite of responding to climate change in any meaningful fashion, but it's insufficient. And that's my concern, is that that's why I'm in this discussion, a lot of it is focused on the other part of it, the political aspect, the who are the emitters and so forth. But I'm not hiding from the fact that technology is key. But I also think that doesn't mean technology that's still in the laboratory, technology that's in pilot schemes. Most of the technology we need to employ is already fully understood. Retrofitting our homes so they're much more efficient, moving towards buses and trams and e-bikes and active transport. All these things are well understood that we should be doing today, and there are many more. But instead, I think we focus usually on these sort of more exotic technologies that are more exciting for us to consider. And yes, some of those we have to look at, and we've spoken about that tonight, that there is I'll go stronger. There is a role for seriously looking at issues like geoengineering and carbon dioxide removal. Things I'm concerned about from their political repercussions in terms of discussing them and doing that research itself, how that may play into how we delay action today. Nevertheless, I think we have to have the maturity to go ahead and look at these technologies. But these are exotic outlier technologies when most of the technology we need to use are the ones we already have at hand. And so I hope I haven't given the impression that I don't think technology is part of the discussion. It absolutely is, and I think it helps us when we start to apply some numbers to some of those technologies. So a lot of the technology advocates that I hear, particularly in the energy field, when they talk about technology, they often talk about it in quite a generic way, without actually doing any sort of analysis on the numbers, particularly the time frame of deployment. That is really very common. So I heard Hannah Ritchie saying the other day, we could easily solve climate change. This is one of the options. She had many other options out there, with a very small part of the world's landmass producing nuclear power. Now, I'm pretty agnostic about nuclear power. The problem is you couldn't do that fast enough. But the question of time wasn't brought up. So a technology was evoked, and indeed she also evoked different ones about wind and solar. But a technology was evoked, but without a time frame issue factoring in there. And I think the point about that is the technologies are important, but they've got to be looked at within some sort of quantitative context, and arguably a political context as well. Particularly with nuclear, it comes with other issues that people will have. But simply, you cannot build enough. And so that discussion was open to the fact is that nuclear is about 2% of the final energy consumption at the global level. There's about 450 nuclear power stations globally. You couldn't build enough of them fast enough. Even if the whole world was building them at the rate that the French were building them, it would be nowhere near enough to deliver within the carbon budgets that we have. Those carbon budgets that are probably anyway too large. And so I think technology is key, but technology has to be looked at within a political and a quantitative context and a time frame. And very seldom do those advocating big technical solutions actually stand back and do that big picture quantitative analysis. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, well, thanks.
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Yeah,
thanks. So we'll just do a couple more that we have online here. Thanks for your insights. Your responses today indicate that you may want to reevaluate the actions of the International Maritime Organization from 2015 to 2023. It's one of the largest acts of negative geoengineering today, and it had a remarkable effect in just 6 months. Well, I think it's more like a few years. The North Atlantic, we had 0.2 C extra of warming globally, and most of that in the North Atlantic, North Pacific. So the question is, I guess they're asking, would you reconsider your conclusion that there's no solar geoengineering today at scale? We're not doing it on, well, we are doing it on purpose, I should say. We're not doing it with the intention of cooling the Earth, but we are doing it knowingly and intentionally. And it's happening, and it's cooling the Earth by 0.5 to 1 degree already.
Yeah.
So would you agree that that's happening, and that's solar geoengineering to some degree? Unintentional?
I mean, if that's the right term to give it, unintentional. So yes, without a doubt, what we are doing is, I mean, this is what we're talking about, climate change. What we are doing is changing the climate. So
right.
If you want
to which is, Jim Hansen says, we need SRM and CDR to reduce the geoengineering we're doing to the planet.
So what we're doing is geoengineering, which is causing huge, massive implications. And rather than shut that geoengineering down, we're going to layer it with other forms of geoengineering. So we're going to have geoengineering layered on top of geoengineering. Somewhere in that, I feel a little uneasy. I would rather...
Well, when you get cancer from smoking cigarettes, we give you chemotherapy, which is laying technology on top of what you should have been doing.
I would suggest the first thing you do is stop smoking.
Yeah.
No, but you go, no, that's the...
But we already did that. I mean, we already smoked, and we already emitted 2.4 trillion tons. I mean,
But that's my concern. We're not even stopping smoking. We're just carrying
on.
I
agree with you. But we also have been doing it. It's kind of an interesting question, by the way. We keep talking about our agency, and let's finish with this one, because this is right back to your expertise.
Just on the IMO one. I mean, that was the question.
Okay.
So the International Maritime Organization, I have colleagues who work in some detail on the issues. Firstly, the IMO, the global shipping sector, is taking this issue far more seriously. Not seriously enough, but that's true of every sector. My understanding from my colleagues is that it's taken this issue far more seriously than the aviation sector, who's basically just offshored this to other people via various offsetting mechanisms, because there's nothing they can do technically in the immediate to near term, in the time frame that matters for addressing climate change. And so they're basically just pushing the challenge onto other people to reduce emissions more rapidly. The IMO is trying to do something significant. The IMO is looking at actually reducing its emissions, or I think eliminating its emissions, or thereabouts, roundabout by 2050. Not fast enough.
And you're speaking of CO2 emissions, because what they've been doing is reducing sulfur emissions.
Yeah, but
quite successfully.
CO2 emissions. And they're looking at a number of methods for doing that. And there were lots more people looking at those sets of issues. So someone, I think it was Saul
Griffith?
Saul Griffith talked about. He talked about shipping there. But firstly, a large part of shipping, I can't remember exactly what it is, like 40 to 50% of shipping is shipping fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels, yeah. I think it's more, but yeah, there's something around that, yeah.
So if you're not going to use fossil fuels, that could be significantly reduced. But you have to be quite careful. Remember, the UK is massively engaged now in shipping wood chips. I mean, the idea of burning wood is, to me, it remains bonkers. But we're shipping huge quantities of wood chips from North America to the UK to burn in a power station at really low efficiency, and one of the biggest power stations in Europe. So
we count that as emissions reduction.
Yeah, we do.
We cut the tree down now, release the CO2, we'll grow it over 20, 30 years to replace it, right? Yeah.
So with shipping, there are things you can. So you're going to try to ship this fossil fuels, and hopefully we won't move towards something as ludicrous as biomass. There are things you can do as soon as you go slower shipping. It's a cube law, so you can significantly reduce the energy consumption, which removes both the sulfur and the CO2 if there is sulfur in the fuel. It doesn't remove it; it reduces the amount that is emitted. There are colleagues of ours that are working on various forms of wind assist that go on ships. So things like Flettner rotors that you can retrofit to existing ships. And then you look at optimizing routes so that you can use the better wind conditions. So that can help supplement whatever the power source is for the ships. There are other fuel options that people are considering, ranging, and I say it's not my area, but particularly from batteries through to ammonia and so forth. And there are drawbacks and benefits to these various options that are there. But the shipping industry is trying to take this issue seriously. And the sulfur issue, I think, I would not be saying that what they've done is a mistake there. I don't think that was geoengineering. The sulfur needed to be removed anyway because it's a real health issue in the ports where those ships are going to. So the sulfur had to be removed for very good health reasons. We mustn't think that we're only trying to solve climate change. Climate change is a symptom of something much more deeply embedded in our norms, and it sort of is overly privileged. I think we're not thinking about the other ecological and social challenges we're facing. So I wouldn't suggest putting sulfur back into the ship fuels to try and provide it as a geoengineering solution to temperatures. I think there are many other things we should be doing ahead of considering putting more sulfates in the atmosphere.
Well, except that accidental SRM has cooled the Earth by 0.5 to 1 degree, so we're already at 2 to 2.5 degrees right now. If we got rid of it tomorrow, which for health reasons we should. And by the way, we're trying to. Yeah. China's cleaning up its coal emissions, but it's over the oceans where it's black, very dark water versus white cloud, reflective clouds. It's having a much larger effect than everyone thought it would.
Yeah, but then we start doing things like we're going to start, spraying silicon beads all over the Antarctic and Greenland, are we? I mean, it's just there's a sort of, there's a sort of hubris here that we're so clever we can't even switch the lights off when we leave a room, but we're okay. It's okay to cover the poles in silicon beads or the oceans in sulfur. I mean, there is something
in a curtain around the Thwaites Glacier or something.
Yeah, those sorts of things. I think it's sort of deeply problematic, this way of thinking. That's not to say that we shouldn't, as I said before, I don't want to get the impression that we shouldn't be thinking about these issues. Yes, we should. But
okay, so let's end with this one because it's kind of following on that. We've emitted 2.4 trillion tons of CO2, and trees and land and soils absorb roughly half. There's about 1.1 trillion now extra in the atmosphere, which is 50% more than it used to be only a couple hundred years ago. Yeah. So that's mind-boggling, by the way. But that's 2.4 trillion tons. We emit 40-ish a year, which is something like 1.5% of the total, maybe a little more than that, 1.5 to 2% of the total each year. So your focus is on how are we going to get rid of this 2% extra a year that we're adding to this 2.4 trillion tons. And isn't that not adequate? In other words, yes, we should, because we're just making it worse, but it's already so bad, 2.4 trillion tons. That it's going to, even on its own, even if we got to net zero, the oceans are going to continue to rise for a long time. And the last time CO2 was today's level, sea levels were about 75 feet higher than they are now, right?
So I think the oceans, without a doubt, I think even if we eliminate emissions immediately, there are a whole suite of ecological issues and impacts that will play out over time. But the oceans is probably the most obvious one there, where what we lock in goes on for centuries. Some of the other ones would stop quite quickly. And again, this comes down to, like most things, issues of consequences and risk, or risk and consequences. The science consensus at the moment is that if we eliminated emissions, we've said about this, it's just some theoretical framing, we're not going to eliminate emissions immediately, but if you did, then the temperatures would quite quickly stabilize out. We might get a couple of decades of warming. Other people think it will be much more. From a policy perspective, I would still rather us think of more like the worst case rather than the best case. We always tend to go for the best case. But whether we think of it in the Jim Hansen framing or in the IPCC framing, and I was recently talking with Piers Friedingstein about this, about aerosols, and there was different views of how important the aerosols are and how that plays out in terms of the size of the carbon budget. So there are different interpretations of this. But whether you take the IPCC, the much more conservative aspects, or the Jim Hansen side, both of which have scientific legitimacy, the response is the same. And this is why I think we have to be careful not to get locked into sort of arguing in the old sort of metaphor of angels on the head of a pin, really, because that is what we risk doing. We need to, whether it's GIMS or IPCC, we have to eliminate fossil fuel emissions like there's no tomorrow. So we need to almost overnight, as rapidly as we can. Not that's convenient, not that's just fits in with the way that the wealthy few of us are responsible for most emissions. Not that at all, but bring them down incredibly fast. So by 2040, probably, we'd have to be zero emissions of carbon dioxide in any reasonable sense. That's probably the earliest we can deliver. We couldn't deliver on 1.5. If you draw a straight line from where we are now to 1.5, we're
1.5 now.
Yes, we are at 1.5. And again, there we have to be quite careful about the language. The conservative aspect of that would say, if you look at the trend line, we're probably about 1.3. But actually, we're measuring 1.5, and it may be that 1.5 doesn't.
No, we're measuring 1.6.
Yeah.
And if it cools off, maybe we'll get to 1.4, and that's 1.5.
So that discussion, that nuanced discussion can be had, but I don't think it changes the policy framing. And this is my point. The policy framing, which is what we need to be focusing on now. I mean, it's all very nice, this sort of nuanced discussions we have about aerosols or the size of the carbon budget and all these other things. But basically, regardless of any of that now, we're left to the point where we've got to do everything we can in terms of eliminating emissions as fast as we could possibly manage to achieve. Not what's just convenient, but what we, I would say 2040 at a sort of global level. And it may well be that on top of that, we should be considering what do we do with the impacts that level of emissions is likely to lock in, issues of sea level rise, some of the other impacts. And that is where I think we need to be doing the research. We said right at the beginning about some of the geoengineering options, some of the carbon dioxide removal options. I would prefer carbon dioxide removal to geoengineering. My preference. That's not to say we shouldn't research both of those. And I'm saying that with all the caveats that we've discussed over the last 2 hours, that is likely to mean if large swathe of the policy realm will misuse that, and the expert realm will misuse that to say we can carry on emissions today. So that cannot be permitted. We have to stand up as experts and say that is not good enough. And so I think if you then sort of say, well, right, eliminate emissions and research these other things. And for me personally, I would say carbon dioxide removal, which I think at the moment is deeply problematic, whether we're about to deliver it, but doing the sorts of levels that the IPCC talk about is important. We need to be researching this, and then also researching the geoengineering. Whether we put these things in place, particularly the geoengineering, I think I'm much more interested in hearing the voices from the global south on that. The carbon dioxide removal, I think whether in the global south, the global north, it doesn't matter. We need to be doing that as well, as quickly as we can. But it doesn't have the same geographical repercussions. It's a global issue, just removing the CO2. So let's remove the CO2 as fast as we possibly can. Let's do the research and try to understand the issues from the science, the technology, and the governance issues on the geoengineering. And let's be guided very much by whatever mechanisms could be used to get global south voices into that debate. And they should be much more dominant than global north voices on geoengineering. And so, as I say, I don't think the nuances of aerosols, the nuances of carbon budgets really change the policy landscape that we have on this.
Wow. So I think this has been a different discussion than I typically have on climate chat, and I think it's different than most people have on climate change. And so I thank you for that, because I do agree that being frank and honest is a key to doing anything in the future. We have to really know what the problem is, and you've been doing your part to let us know. So thank you for that, and thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you for your time today. And I just do want to remind people that there are links in the description to Climate Uncensored. If you want to help support that, or foundations or individuals that might want to contribute to that would help get Kevin's message out. There's also, they can follow you on Blue Sky and on Twitter, and there's links there. Please, everyone, we talked about it a few times. One of the things that everyone can do is talk to everyone you know about climate. Tell them about your concerns. Tell them that you want action. And once everyone's talking about it, that's when maybe we'll begin. So as part of that, like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, all those things. And Kevin, thanks again. I really appreciate it. And I look forward there's a lot of things we didn't get to cover, so I look forward to doing this again sometime.
We can do it again as well. Thanks also to thanks Dan for you, and to Stacey and others involved in producing this, your channel and all the other engagement on these issues. The experts alone are not going to solve this problem. We need far more people engaged in this. So it's really great to see what you're trying to drive, and the range of interviews that you have. And these discussions are challenging. They're difficult for us personally. Significant credit to you and Stacey for opening up this debate.
Great. Well, thank you. And to everyone, we'll see you next time. Next week, we'll be talking about AMOC and the challenges of that. And if you are new to the channel, take a look at our past episodes. There's previous 2 interviews with Kevin. The first one is back in the old Clubhouse days when it was audio only, but still a very interesting, great interview, I must say. That was maybe our most popular episode on Clubhouse. And one from earlier this year that you can also listen to as well, plus many other people. So check it out. And thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.